There is a kind of silence that has nothing to do with sound. It is the silence of a person who has decided, after a very long time, to stop pretending they did not hear, to stop pretending they did not see, to stop folding themselves small enough to disappear into the walls of a house that was never theirs. That kind of silence is heavy. It builds for years. And when it finally breaks, when the person carrying it finds a way to let it out, the sound it makes can travel further than a scream, further than a gunshot, further than anything, because it travels through paper. What you are about to hear is the account of a woman named Dora. She was a cook on a sugar plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s. She spent nearly 2 decades feeding a family that never once learned her last name. She stirred their pots and salted their meat and listened to every word spoken in that house. Because when you are treated like furniture, people forget you are in the room. They told her nothing. They told her everything. They told. And one night, in the summer of 1857, for reasons that historians and archivists have debated ever since a bundle of handwritten pages was discovered inside the false bottom of an oak chest in 1923, Dora wrote it all down. Every secret, every name, every night she had pretended not to hear. This is her story. Stay with it until the end. Because the most unsettling thing about what happened at Belhaven Plantation is not what Dora witnessed. It is what happened to the people who found out she had written it down. The Belhaven Plantation sat 12 miles south of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, on land that had been cleared, drained, and made productive through decades of labor that its owner, Gerald Haverfield, preferred not to think about directly. He thought about the yields instead. He thought about the price of sugar in New Orleans, about the weight of barrels, about weather patterns and the health of the cane. He was a man who had trained himself to see the operation without seeing the human machinery that ran it. The way a person can learn to look at a clock and read the time without ever thinking about the gears. Gerald was 53 years old in the summer of 1857. He had the broad, reddened face of a man who spent too much time on horseback under a southern sun and too many evenings on his veranda with a glass of bourbon. He was not a cruel man in the way that the word implies deliberate pleasure in cruelty. He was something more ordinary and in many ways more dangerous. He was a man who simply did not look. He did not look at the people who worked for him. He did not look at the accounts his overseer kept in the grey ledger book. He did not look at the faces of the women who carried his meals from the separate kitchen house, through the garden, and up the back steps into his dining room. Dora had been doing that walk for 18 years. She had been brought to Belhaven in 1839, when she was approximately 19 years old. The records from the estate where she had previously lived were incomplete, as records for enslaved people often were, more thorough about livestock than about human beings. She had come to the plantation already knowing how to cook. Her previous mistress had kept a kitchen that required precision. And Dora had learned that the kitchen was a place where competence could buy a kind of quiet authority. A cook who produced poor meals was punished. A cook who produced excellent ones was left alone to produce them. She learned very early that excellence was a form of armor. By 1857, Dora was somewhere in her mid to late 30s. She ran the plantation kitchen with the focused efficiency of a woman who had long understood that the only space truly available to her was the one she carved out through skill. The kitchen house itself was a separate building behind the main house, a common arrangement in Louisiana plantations, both for the practical reason of keeping cooking fires away from the main structure and for the social reason of keeping the people who did the cooking at a visible remove from the people who ate what they cooked. The kitchen was approximately 40 feet from the main house's rear entrance. There was a covered walkway, a pergola overgrown with jasmine that bloomed white and sweet from April through October. Dora walked that path many times each day. And the thing about that path, the thing that mattered enormously, though no one who designed the architecture had considered it, was that the rear windows of Gerald Haverfield's study sat directly above the back steps where the path ended. Gerald Haverfield conducted much of his private business in that study. He conducted it with the windows open, because the Louisiana summer heat was relentless, and because he had, over 18 years, completely ceased to register Dora's presence in the way one ceases to register the sound of a clock ticking in a room they've slept in for years. This was his most consequential error. Dora had been born into a world that required her to make constant, rapid calculations about what she knew, what she could say, and what she was required to pretend not to know. This was not unique to her. It was the particular intelligence that the system demanded from people in her position. A kind of perpetual, exhausting vigilance that went unacknowledged because it was invisible, and because acknowledging it would have required the people around her to admit it existed. She knew things about the Haverfield family that they believed were known only to themselves. She knew that Gerald's eldest son, Philip, 26, handsome in the way of men who have always been handsome and have done nothing interesting with it, was 3 months behind on debts he had accumulated in New Orleans that his father did not know about. She knew this because Philip had received 2 letters in the spring of that year, and she had been standing at the bottom of the main staircase when he read them, and the sound a man makes when he reads a letter that frightens him is distinctive, and she had listened. She knew that Gerald's wife, Cecily, a thin, precise woman from a Virginia family that had once had more land and prestige than money, and who had spent 20 years married to Gerald, compensating for what she privately considered a social disappointment, had been writing letters to her sister in Richmond that she did not send through the usual post. She sent them through a trusted friend in Baton Rouge, who posted them from there. Cecily had mentioned this arrangement in a conversation with that friend in the parlor of the main house one afternoon, speaking in the lowered tones that polite Southern women used when they wished to be discreet, not realizing that lowered tones in a house with wooden floors and high ceilings carry differently than they imagine, and that Dora had been in the hallway outside the parlor door, adieu, sting a tray. She knew that Gerald's younger son, Robert, 19, narrow and possessed of a nervous intelligence that made everyone in the household slightly uncomfortable, had been spending time in parts of the parish that his father would not have approved of, meeting with people his father would not have approved of, and reading documents that could have caused serious difficulties for the entire family. Had they come to the attention of certain men in Baton Rouge. She knew all of this the way a river knows the shape of its banks, passively, continuously, without being asked, and she had kept it the way water keeps the shape of a vessel, perfectly and without effort. For 18 years what Dora knew had stayed inside her. It had no outlet. It had nowhere to go. She was a cook on a plantation in Louisiana in the 1850s, and the idea that she might share what she knew with anyone who could do something useful with it was so structurally impossible that it barely formed as a thought. It was simply weight, something she carried. Until the summer of 1857, when 3 things happened in rapid succession that changed the nature of what she was carrying from weight into something more dangerous, something with edges. The first thing happened in June. A man arrived at Belhaven who had not been expected. His name was Cyrus Holt, and he was, by his own description, a business associate of Gerald Haverfield's from Memphis, come south on a matter of some delicacy. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon on horseback, with a leather satchel that he kept close to his person at all times, and a manner that Dora, who had a long experience with the difference between men who were comfortable and men who were pretending to be comfortable, recognized immediately as the latter. Gerald Haverfield received Cyrus Holt in his study with the windows open because it was June in Louisiana, and the alternative was suffocating. Dora walked the jasmine path 3 times that afternoon. She did not slow down. She did not position herself deliberately beneath the window. She simply walked at her usual pace, carrying what she was carrying, and she listened to what the open window offered her, because she had learned long ago that the best way to hear things was not to appear to be trying. What she heard, in fragments, the natural fragments of a person walking beneath a window rather than standing still, was enough. Cyrus Holt had come about a debt. Not Philip's debt, which was the debt of a young man who drank too much and played cards badly. This was a different kind of debt, of a different magnitude. Gerald Haverfield had, it appeared, entered into an arrangement some years prior with a group of men whose business interests were, to put it in the language of 1857 Louisiana, irregular. The arrangement had been profitable for several years. It was no longer profitable, and the men Cyrus Holt represented were not patient men, and the figure that passed through the open window and reached Dora's ears as she walked beneath it was large enough that she felt something she hadn't expected. She felt frightened for the family, not because she cared for them, exactly. It was something more complicated than care. It was the fear of the servant for the household, the particular anxiety of knowing that if the house falls, everyone inside it falls differently, but everyone falls. She took the food inside and said nothing. The second thing happened in early July. It involved Robert. Robert Haverfield had been, for the past year, quietly and carefully doing something that in 1857 Louisiana was not merely socially unacceptable, but actively dangerous. He had been attending meetings. Not political meetings in any formal sense, not the kind of meetings that men of his family's standing attended in town with other men of similar standing to talk about yields and tariffs and the price of things. Different meetings. Small gatherings in back rooms and private homes, the kind of meetings that left no public record and that participants referred to in correspondence only obliquely, in language that required a shared understanding to decode. Dora had known about Robert's activities for several months. She had seen the looks he exchanged with certain visitors. She had noticed which letters he opened before bringing them to his father's attention and which he pocketed. She had observed the pattern of his absences. But in early July, something changed. A man came to the rear of the kitchen house. Not the main entrance, not the formal approach that any legitimate visitor would use, but the back, through the vegetable garden, in the late evening when the light was going and the household was moving toward the routines that preceded sleep. He was a slight man, older than Robert, with calloused hands and a deliberate, careful way of moving. He had come to speak with Dora, not about Robert, about something Robert was carrying. The man, he gave no name, and Dora did not ask for one, because she understood that names in this kind of conversation were dangerous things. Explained that Robert had taken something he ought not to have taken, something that had been entrusted to the movement that Robert had attached himself to, and that this something needed to be returned or forwarded without going through Robert, who had, in recent weeks, become unreliable in ways that alarmed the people who depended on him. The man asked Dora if she would be willing to help. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the jasmine path and the open window and 18 years of walking quietly and hearing everything and carrying it alone. She said she would think about it. The man left the way he had come, through the vegetable garden, and Dora stood in her kitchen for a long time after, listening to the sound of the house settling in the heat. She was thinking. But she was also, for the first time in a very long time, remembering what it felt like to be asked. The third thing happened in the middle of July. It was the thing that changed everything. And it began with a conversation she was not supposed to hear, in a room she was not supposed to be near, at a time when everyone in the main house believed she was in the kitchen. She was not in the kitchen. She was at the bottom of the back staircase, having come up through the rear entrance to replace the candles in the hallway sconces, a task she typically performed in the afternoon, but which she had been delayed in doing because of preparations for a dinner that Gerald Haverfield was hosting that evening. It was past 4 o'clock. The hallway was dim, the shutters half closed against the afternoon heat. The study door was not fully latched. Gerald and Cyrus Holt were inside. Cyrus had not left after his June visit. He had stayed, which was itself unusual, and his continued presence had created a tension in the household that had been building for weeks. Gerald had told Cecily that Holt was helping with business matters, and Cecily, whose intelligence was considerable but whose access to her husband's affairs was structurally limited, had accepted this explanation with the particular expression of a woman who has learned not to ask questions and has trained herself not to regret not asking them. But this afternoon, through the unlatched study door, what Dora heard was not about the debt she already knew about. It was about a man who lived in Baton Rouge, a man who was, according to Cyrus Holt, asking questions he should not be asking. A man who had begun making inquiries about a series of transactions that connected Gerald Haverfield to the group of men whose representative Holt was, transactions that had occurred over a period of years, and that involved things that, if exposed in the right way to the right people, would destroy Gerald Haverfield entirely and implicate several other men of similar standing in the parish. Cyrus Holt was explaining, in a voice that was very calm and very precise, what he believed should be done about this man. Gerald Haverfield did not respond immediately. There was a long silence. Then he said something in a voice so low that Dora, at the base of the stairs, caught only part of it. The part she caught was enough. She stood very still. She finished replacing the candles. She walked back down the hall and out through the rear entrance and down the jasmine path to the kitchen house. She stoked the fire under the pot for the evening's dinner. She stirred. She salted. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. She thought about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked if she would help. She thought about Philip's debts and Cecily's secret letters and Robert's dangerous meetings and 18 years of knowing and carrying and staying silent. And she began, in the back of her mind, to compose. If you've been listening this far, stay with us, because what Dora had collected over 18 years is about to become the most dangerous inventory you've ever heard of. And we're just getting started. The thing about being invisible in a house is that you are not actually invisible. You are simply categorized differently. You are furniture. You are appliance. You are part of the mechanism. And mechanisms are not expected to observe, so no one accounts for the fact that they do. Dora had been observing since 1839. She had a memory that she had never been given credit for because she had never been given the opportunity to demonstrate it. She could recall conversations from years past with the fidelity of a court stenographer. The exact words, the exact tone, the exact silences that fell between words, and that sometimes said more than the words themselves. This was not a gift she had cultivated for any particular purpose. It was something she had developed the way anyone develops a skill that keeps them safe, by necessity and over time. Let us consider what Dora knew by the summer of 1857. She knew the full architecture of Gerald Haverfield's financial life, not because anyone had explained it to her, but because financial anxiety is one of the loudest things a household can contain, and it expresses itself in the quality of meals requested, in the length of conversations conducted in the study after supper, in the way a man's shoulders sit when he comes to the dinner table. She had watched Gerald's body tell the story his mouth would not tell for years. She knew that Belhaven had been mortgaged in 1853. She knew this because she had overheard Gerald dictating a letter to his clerk that spring, and because she had seen the clerk's face when he returned to the plantation 3 days after posting it. And because when a man's face looks the way that Clark's face looked, the news is never good. She knew that the sugar yields had been declining since 1854. She knew this because of the dinner conversations, the way Gerald talked about the cane when the yields were good, expansively with the proprietary satisfaction of a man who equates his land's production with his own virtue, versus the way he talked about it in recent years, briefly, with a deflective quality, steering the conversation toward other things. She knew that Gerald had been entertaining men from New Orleans who were not the usual sort of men he entertained. She had served these men. She had watched them. They arrived in good clothes and they had the manners of men accustomed to being accommodated. But beneath the manners, there was something else. A patience that was not the patience of men waiting for something good, but the patience of men who were certain of an outcome. She had learned over many years to distinguish between these two kinds of patience. The men from New Orleans had come several times between 1853 and 1856. After 1856, they stopped coming to Belhaven. Instead, Cyrus Holt came. This distinction was not lost on Dora. What Dora knew about Philip was, at its core, the story of a young man who had been given everything except the capacity to manage it. Philip Haverfield had grown up as the heir to something: the plantation, the position, the particular social standing that came with owning land and being white in Louisiana in the middle of the 19th century. He had grown up knowing he would have these things, and this knowledge had produced in him a confidence that was real but hollow, the way a building can look solid from the outside, while the interior structure is compromised. He had gone to New Orleans for the first time at 18 and had returned different. Not obviously so, not in ways his parents would have immediately recognized, but different in the way that a person is different when they have discovered something about themselves that their family's world has no vocabulary for. Dora had recognized the change immediately. She had seen it in the way he ate, hurriedly, as though meals were interruptions, and in the way he moved through the plantation house, restlessly, as though he were always on his way somewhere else, always waiting to leave. He had been going to New Orleans regularly since then. He brought back gifts for his mother, excuses for his father, and debts that grew with each trip with the patient consistency of compound interest. The men he owed money to were not men who would wait indefinitely. Dora knew this not from overhearing any conversation about them specifically, but from the quality of the letters that arrived for Philip, the ones he received and immediately burned rather than leaving them on the desk in his room. She knew letters were burned because she was responsible for cleaning the fireplaces and burned paper leaves a particular ash. By July of 1857, the ash in Philip's fireplace was accumulating at a rate that told a story all by itself. Cecily Haverfield was the most complicated person in Dora's world and the one she had spent the most time thinking about. She was not a bad woman. Dora had decided this years ago with the careful objectivity of someone who has had ample time and close proximity to make an assessment. Cecily was a woman who had made her choices within the narrow set of choices available to women of her position in her time, and she had made them efficiently and without visible regret, which is not the same as making them happily. She ran the household with a precision that bordered on compulsion. Every surface in the main house was maintained at a standard that required constant effort from the people who maintained it. She entertained with a graciousness that guests remembered and remarked on. She dressed carefully and spoke carefully and managed the family's social relationships with the strategic attentiveness of a diplomat. But she was not happy. Dora knew this the way she knew most things about the family, from proximity and observation. She knew it from the way Cecily sat at the breakfast table when Gerald had already gone out for the morning. The particular quality of stillness that came over her, the way she would hold her coffee cup with both hands and look out the window at the garden and not see anything she was looking at. The letters to her sister in Richmond were the most revealing thing about Cecily, and they were also the most dangerous, because the sister in Richmond was not writing back through the usual channels either. And the letters the sister was sending, which arrived occasionally, addressed in a hand that Cecily always took directly, never leaving on the front table where the mail was usually sorted, were not ordinary letters. Dora did not know their full content. She was not in the habit of reading letters that were not addressed to her, and in any case, Cecily kept hers private in a way that would have made access difficult. But she knew something of their content from Cecily's responses to them, from the way Cecily's posture changed after reading them, the way she would sometimes go directly to the writing desk in the parlor after reading and write immediately, with a speed and energy that was different from her usual correspondence. The sister in Richmond was helping Cecily plan something. Dora did not know what, but she had been watching the pattern for almost a year, and patterns, in her experience, always resolved eventually into something recognizable. Robert was the one who worried her most. Not because of the danger of what he was involved in, though that danger was real and she understood it clearly. What worried her about Robert was something more specific: the gap between his intelligence and his judgment. He was a genuinely bright young man. She had seen this since his childhood, in the way he read, voraciously, systematically, with the absorption of someone who was not performing literacy for social purposes, but actually consuming ideas. He had grown up in a household where the library was well stocked and largely decorative, and he had worked through a significant portion of it by the time he was 15, which was how he had encountered the ideas that had quietly, thoroughly reorganized his understanding of the world he had been born into. The problem was that his intelligence had outpaced his caution. He had become involved with people who were doing serious, dangerous work, with a care and discretion forged in the awareness of exactly what the consequences of exposure were. Robert, who had come to these ideas through reading rather than experience, had not yet developed that same bone-deep understanding of consequence. He was careful in the way a person is careful when they understand a rule intellectually, not the way a person is careful when they have watched what happens to people who are not. The man who had come through the vegetable garden in July had said Robert was becoming unreliable. He had not elaborated, but Dora understood what the word meant in the context. Unreliable did not mean disloyal. It meant careless. And careless, in 1857, Louisiana, was a word with consequences that extended far beyond the person being careless. She had watched Robert at dinner in the weeks following the man's visit. She watched the way he listened when his father talked, with a contained intensity that to Gerald probably looked like attentiveness, but that Dora recognized as something else entirely. She watched the way he occasionally looked at his plate rather than his father's face when Gerald said certain things, the careful control of an expression that wanted to change. He was building toward something. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, a change in the pressure of things. And she did not know if when it arrived, it would break cleanly or break everything. Don't go anywhere. What happens next is the part that explains why this story was hidden for 60 years and why, when it was finally found, the people who found it weren't sure they should have. Dora could not read. This is important to establish clearly because it changes the nature of what she eventually did, and because the act itself, the act of writing it all down, required something that she did not have access to in the ordinary course of her life in 1857. She had not been taught to read. This was not an accident. Louisiana, like all slaveholding states, maintained laws prohibiting the formal education of enslaved people, laws that reflected a correct understanding on the part of the people who wrote them, that literacy was a form of power, and that power was precisely what the system required its enslaved population to be denied. But Dora had learned things anyway. She had learned the way a person learns in a world that officially denies them access to learning, obliquely, through proximity, through the particular human ability to absorb more than you are given credit for absorbing. She could not read a page of text with fluency, but she could read enough. She had learned her letters over years of kitchen proximity to household papers, menus written in Cecily's precise hand and left on the kitchen table, lists, notes, labels on supply jars. She had cross-referenced these with sounds she heard, the way a child learns language before they are taught to, by pattern, by context, by repetition. She could write her name. She had learned this much at her previous household from another woman who had learned it the same way. She could write approximately 40 words with reasonable confidence. Words she had practiced in the ash of the kitchen hearth when she was alone, words she had learned from labels and lists and the occasional scrap of paper that passed through her kitchen. This was not enough to write a comprehensive account, but it was not the only tool she had. There was a boy named Lenny. He was 14 years old in the summer of 1857, and he worked in the Haverfield stables. He was small for his age, quick, and possessed of a quality of attention that, in a different world, would have been called scholarly. He had learned to read through a method that was both common and officially invisible in plantation households. He had listened to the lessons given to the Haverfield children by their tutor, standing outside the schoolroom window on the pretense of various maintenance tasks, and he had listened for years, with the same systematic patience that Dora brought to overhearing conversations through open windows. He was better at it than Dora. He had started younger. Dora had known about Lenny's literacy for approximately 3 years. She had known because she had seen him reading, not performing the presence of reading, not holding something upside down or turning pages at random intervals, but actually reading, the way a literate person reads, with his eyes moving and his lips occasionally shaping words, and his face responding to content. She had seen this on 2 occasions, in moments when he had believed himself unobserved, and she had not said anything about it to anyone. She had simply noted it and waited. In the late summer of 1857, she told Lenny what she needed. She was careful about how she asked. She understood the full weight of what she was requesting, not just the risk of the act itself, but the particular risk of asking a 14-year-old boy to carry any portion of that weight. She thought about this for several days before she spoke to him. She thought about whether there was another way. There was not another way that she could find. She came to the stables one evening after the main house had gone to supper. She told him, in plain and specific terms, what she needed him to do. She did not minimize the risk. She did not pretend that what she was asking was ordinary. She looked at him directly, in the way that she knew adults in that household did not look at him, and she gave him the choice. He said yes. Then he looked at her with those quick, serious eyes and said, "Where are we going to get the paper?" This was, of course, the central practical problem. Paper in a plantation household was not casually available. It was kept in the study, in Cecily's writing desk in the parlor, in the schoolroom. Taking it in quantity sufficient for what Dora needed to do would be noticed. It took them 2 weeks to solve this problem. The solution came from an unlikely source: the inventory of the supply room, which Dora managed, and for which she was responsible for keeping basic written records, a concession made to practical necessity because the plantation's kitchen required a written inventory for the overseer's accounting, and since Dora ran the kitchen, she was the one who maintained it. The records she kept were basic, and the paper she used for them was coarse wrapping paper rather than the fine stationery in the study. But it was paper. She began accumulating it slowly, 1 or 2 sheets at a time, over the course of 2 weeks in August. She recorded the missing sheets by entering them in the inventory at slightly different intervals, so that the total count remained consistent when reviewed. It was a small and precise deceit, the kind that she was capable of because 18 years of careful observation had taught her exactly how often the supply records were checked, and by whom and with what level of attention. By mid-August, she had enough paper. The ink was a different problem, solved more simply. Lenny stole a small bottle of writing ink from the schoolroom supply closet, replacing it with a bottle of similar size that he had filled with water tinted with kitchen blacking. The replacement was imperfect, but it would not be discovered quickly, and quickly was all they needed. They were ready. She did not write it herself. This is critical to understand. Dora dictated, and Lenny wrote. They worked in the kitchen house after the main household was asleep, which in summer in Louisiana meant well past 10 o'clock, when the heat of the day finally began to release its grip, and the house settled into the particular sounds of sleep. The creak of beds, the sound of Gerald's light snoring that carried through the open windows, the eventual silence of even the dogs. The first night, they sat for nearly an hour saying nothing, while Dora organized herself. She had never done anything like this before. She had thoughts, she had memories, she had 18 years of accumulated knowledge. But the act of translating that into something sequential and recordable was a different task than simply knowing things, and she needed time to understand the structure she was going to use. Lenny waited with the patience of a boy who has spent years doing exactly this, waiting, observing, staying still long enough for the world to show him more than it meant to. Eventually she began. She did not start with the most dramatic thing. She started at the beginning, with what she had observed in the first years after her arrival, the shape of the household as she had first understood it, the personalities as they had first presented themselves to her. This was a choice that reflected something about how she thought, and it made what came later more legible and more terrible, because by the time she reached the events of 1857, the reader would understand exactly how each person had arrived at the moment they were now in. She spoke quietly and directly. Lenny wrote quickly, in a hand that was not beautiful but was clear. The hand of someone self-taught and practical, aimed at legibility rather than elegance. They worked for approximately 2 hours the first night. Then Dora stood, stretched, covered the pages under the loose board in the floor of the kitchen where she kept the few small things that were hers, and went to her sleeping place. They did this for 9 nights. 9 nights. The kitchen house had no clock, but Dora had an internal sense of time that was accurate to within a quarter hour, a capacity developed over years of managing the precise timing that cooking requires. She knew how long each night's session lasted. She knew on the 4th night that they had covered approximately half of what she needed to say. She knew on the 7th night that they were approaching the part that was most dangerous to put on paper. She did not hesitate. She had already decided by the time she sat down on the 1st night that if she was going to do this at all, she was going to do it completely. Partial truth, she understood, was just a more elaborate form of silence. And she had been silent long enough. So she told Lenny about the conversation she had heard through the study window in June. She told him about Cyrus Holt and the nature of the debt and the men from New Orleans and the figure that had floated through the open window and settled in her mind like something she had caught in a trap and could not release. She told him about the man who had come through the vegetable garden and asked about Robert. She told him about the conversation at the bottom of the staircase, the words through the unlatched study door, and what they had implied about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions and what Cyrus Holt believed should be done about him. Lenny's hand slowed when she got to this part, not because he was struggling with the writing, but because he was processing what he was writing, and the processing was taking a moment that his hand needed to reflect. She waited. He looked up at her. She looked back. She said, "Keep writing." He kept writing. She also told Lenny things she had not told anyone before. She told him about a death. In 1851, a man named Terence had died on the Belhaven plantation. He had been one of the field workers, a man in his 40s who had spent years on the plantation, who was well regarded among the others in the quarters, and who had, in the year before his death, been in possession of information that Dora had known about and that she believed had contributed in some indirect but real way to what happened to him. She had no proof of this. She was careful to say so when she dictated it. She said, "I don't know it as a fact. I know it as something that sits in me wrong." But she put it in the pages anyway, because she believed that even what you only know partially deserves to be said when the alternative is that it goes unsaid forever. She told him about a woman named Addie, who had been sold from Belhaven in 1848, under circumstances that the official record of the transaction, if there even was one, would have described with the bureaucratic neutrality of a property transfer. What those records would not describe was the reason. What those records would not describe was the conversation Dora had overheard 2 weeks before the sale in the study through the open window while walking the jasmine path. She had carried Addie's story for 9 years. She put it in the pages. She told him about the visiting men from New Orleans, not just that they came, but what she had observed about their nature, the quality of their patience, the way they looked at the plantation and its people in a way that was different from how planters or business partners look at property, a way that told her something about the nature of the arrangement, though she could not have named Pretai. Seely what it was. She told him about a document she had seen, not read, because she could not read it fully, but seen clearly enough to describe its physical appearance, the letterhead, the signature at the bottom, the shape and arrangement of the text in a way that she believed, in combination with what she had heard, would be legible to someone who could read. She told him about the small, systematic ways in which the accounting of the plantation had been, over the years she had been there, arranged to produce a picture of the operation that was slightly but consistently different from the reality she observed and lived. She told him about a man named August Fry. August Fry was a name that Dora had heard once in passing, in a conversation between Gerald Haverfield and a man she did not recognize who had arrived at the plantation in the late winter of 1855. She had been walking the jasmine path. She was always walking the jasmine path, and she sometimes felt that the most consequential geography of the entire plantation was those 40 feet of covered walkway, and the name had floated down to her from the open study window with the particular weight of a name that the speaker has calculated before saying. Gerald had said the name once, and the other man had responded. And then Gerald had said something that included the word arrangement. And then they had moved to another part of the room or lowered their voices sufficiently that the path offered nothing more. She had kept the name, August Frey. She had no idea who he was or what the arrangement was. But names that are said with that particular care, in that particular tone, in that particular company, she had learned to keep them. She had learned that sometimes the value of a thing is not visible until later, until it combines with something else. The way two unremarkable ingredients can produce something that is neither of them. She put the name in the pages. She would not know until much later, until events that the pages themselves would precipitate, whether August Frey was a person who mattered. But she put him in the pages because she had learned to trust the weight of things. On the 9th night, she dictated the final section. It was different from the rest in tone, not softer, but more personal. She told Lenny to write exactly what she said, not to edit or improve, even if what she said was not written the way a book would be written. She said, "My name is Dora. I have lived on this plantation for 18 years. Everything I have written here is true as I know truth to be, which is what I have observed with my own eyes and heard with my own ears. I am not a person the law would give any authority to, and I know what that means for these pages. But I am writing them because the keeping of things inside you, when they are important, when they involve people being done wrong, the keeping of it is its own kind of harm. I have been careful my whole life. Tonight I am choosing something different from careful." She paused. Lenny waited. She said, "Anyone who finds this, I ask you to think about all the things that were never written down, because the person who knew them was not supposed to know how to write. Think about all the pages that were never made. I made these. That is what I can do." She sat for a moment after she finished. Then she said, "Put the date." Lenny put the date. August 22nd, 1857. Dora had known for several weeks before the writing began where she intended to keep the pages. The chest had been in the kitchen house since before she arrived at Belhaven. It was an old oak chest, heavy, scarred from years of use and rough handling, used for the storage of dry goods, dried beans and rice, and the kind of supplies that kept well and needed to be secured against rodents. The chest was not locked because it did not contain anything that anyone in the main household considered worth locking away. Its interior was divided by a thick wooden insert that sat about 2/3 of the way down, creating an upper portion accessible through the lid and a lower portion that appeared, from a casual inspection, to be the solid base of the chest. It was not the solid base of the chest. Someone, she had no idea who or when, had made the insert removable. Not obviously removable, not in a way that would be noticed unless you already knew to look, but removable. The insert was not fixed. It simply rested on a lip of wood that ran around the interior of the chest, held in place by its weight and by the contents above it. Remove those contents, lift the insert, and there was a space below, perhaps 4 inches deep, running the full interior dimensions of the chest, that was, functionally, invisible to anyone who was not looking for it. Dora had found this space in her 2nd year at Belhaven, when she had dropped a dried bean that had rolled and fallen behind the insert. She had reached in to retrieve it, and her hand had found the space. She had told no one. She had replaced the insert, replaced the beans, and filed the knowledge away. For 15 years the space had been empty. Now it would hold the pages. She wrapped them in a piece of oiled cloth she had saved from a supply delivery. The kind of oiled cloth used to wrap tools for storage, which would protect the paper from the moisture that was inevitable in a Louisiana kitchen. She folded the cloth carefully around the pages, tied it with a length of kitchen twine, and placed it in the space below the insert. She replaced the insert, replaced the bags of dried rice and beans, and closed the lid. She looked at the chest for a moment. She felt something that she did not have a word for, Not exactly relief, not exactly satisfaction, not exactly fear. Something that was all of these, and none of them. The feeling of having done something that cannot be undone, when you have decided that undoing was never the point. She went to bed. September arrived in the manner of Louisiana Septembers, not with any noticeable cooling, that was weeks away yet, but with a quality of light that was different from August, a slightly altered angle that made the shadows longer in the afternoon and gave the evenings a quality of something concluding. Dora watched the household with particular attention in the first days of September. She watched because things had been shifting in the weeks since Cyrus Holt's arrival, and the shift was accelerating. She could feel it in the quality of conversations at the dinner table, the way Gerald spoke more precisely than usual, choosing words with a care that was different from his normal directness, the care of a man who is deciding what to reveal, and to whom. She could feel it in Philip's absences, which had become more frequent and less explained. She could feel it in Cecily's posture at meals, the particular alignment of a woman who is preparing for something. And she could feel it most particularly in Robert, who had become in the past 2 weeks very quiet. Robert's quiet was not the quiet of a person at peace. It was the quiet of a person who has made a decision and is waiting for the right moment to execute it. She knew this quality of quiet because she had lived in it herself all summer. On the 5th of September, a letter arrived for Gerald Haverfield. She knew it was significant not from its content, which she did not see, but from what happened to the household after it arrived. Gerald received it in the morning, read it in his study with the door closed, and then went to find Cyrus Holt, who was staying in the guest room at the rear of the main house. She knew Gerald had gone to Holt because she heard him on the back staircase. She recognized his footfall precisely, 18 years having made her an expert in the particular ways each member of the household moved through the house, and then heard him knock at a door and enter. The conversation behind that door lasted approximately 40 minutes. When Gerald emerged, he went directly to the stables and requested a horse. He rode out within the hour. He did not return until after supper. When he came back, he ate what was sent to his study on a tray, rather than coming to the dinner table, which was unusual enough that Cecily came to find Dora in the kitchen to ask if something was wrong with the food, because she was concerned about Gerald and looking for an explanation that did not require her to go to Gerald himself. Dora said the food was fine. She said Mr. Haverfield had perhaps had a tiring day. Cecily looked at her with an expression that was not quite what it presented itself as, not quite the expression of a woman merely inquiring about dinner logistics, and then nodded and went back to the main house. Dora stood at her kitchen fire and stirred what was in the pot. She thought about the man in Baton Rouge who was asking questions. On the 9th of September, Philip left for New Orleans. This was not unusual in itself. He went to New Orleans regularly, but the circumstances of this departure were different. He left early in the morning before breakfast, without the usual social performance of departure, without the goodbye to his mother that was customary, without the instructions to the household staff that a man going away for some length of time typically gives. He simply left. Dora knew he had gone because one of the girls who worked in the main house mentioned it in the kitchen that morning, confused about whether she was still supposed to prepare his room. She told the girl to prepare it as usual. Then she stood for a moment thinking about what Philip's sudden quiet departure meant in the context of everything else that was happening, and concluded that it meant he knew something was coming and had decided that distance was the appropriate response. Philip Haverfield, in Dora's long assessment of him, was not a person who stayed when things became difficult. He left. He had been leaving for years, in small ways and large ones. This was simply the most decisive version of a pattern she had observed since he was old enough to choose. On the 12th of September, Robert came to the kitchen. He did not come for a reason related to food. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at her in a way that he rarely looked at her, directly, with the quality of someone who is seeing rather than merely looking. He asked if she had a few minutes. She said she did. He came inside and sat at the corner of the kitchen work table, the corner where the light from the window was good, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said something that she would write down later, after the fact. In her own words, in the space of a letter she sent through a channel she will not specify here, a letter that ended up as part of a later archive, and which is why we have our account of what he said. He said, "Dora, I need you to know that whatever happens in the next few weeks, I'm going to make sure that the people in the quarters know what they need to know to make the right choices." He paused. "I need you to know that I know it matters." She looked at him. She said, "What's going to happen in the next few weeks?" He looked at his hands. He said, "I'm not sure of all of it, but things are going to change." She said, "Things always change, Mr. Robert." He looked up at that. He said, "Not like this." She did not tell him about the pages. She looked at him and thought about the 14-year-old boy in the stables who had written them, and about the oilcloth and the false bottom and the oak chest and the 15 years of empty space that had finally, in the last month of summer, been put to use. She said, "I know." He left. She went back to the fire. On the 14th of September, 2 things happened. The first, a stranger came to the plantation. He arrived in the late morning on a hired horse, carrying a document that he required Gerald Haverfield to sign for, which meant he had to be admitted to the study, which meant Dora was informed of his presence by the girl who managed the front entrance, who came to tell Dora that a visitor had arrived so that Dora could prepare a refreshment tray. Dora prepared the tray. She walked through the house. She set the tray on the hallway table outside the study and knocked. Gerald's voice said, "Come." She entered with the tray, set it on the side table, and left. The operation took approximately 45 seconds. In those 45 seconds, she saw the stranger clearly. She saw the document on Gerald's desk, partially unrolled. She saw Gerald's expression. The stranger was from Baton Rouge. She did not know this absolutely, but she was near certain, from a detail she had observed that she could not explain without revealing more than she wishes to explain here. A small, specific, observable detail that told her something about where he had come from. Gerald's expression was the expression of a man who has received what he feared and has been required to receive it in the presence of a witness and cannot show what he feels. She left the study. She walked down the hall. She went back to the kitchen. The second thing that happened that day, Cyrus Holt left Belhaven. He left quietly in the afternoon with his horse and his leather satchel. He said goodbye to no one that Dora was aware of. He simply was there, and then was not there, which in itself was a kind of information. You've come this far with us. What happens in the next days is the part that explains why these pages were sealed away for decades. Stay with us. The household held its breath. Dora had never felt this quality in a place so strongly before. Not even during the difficult periods of previous years, not even during the financial troubles of 1853 or the illness that had swept the quarters in 1855 and killed 4 people in 6 weeks. This was different. This was the specific quality of held breath that preceded not the usual difficulties of a plantation year, but something structural, something that would change the shape of things. She continued cooking. She continued walking the jasmine path. She continued each time she walked it, listening through the windows that were always open because it was September in Louisiana, and the heat had not broken yet. Gerald had gone quiet in a way that was different from his usual taciturnity. He was in the study most of the day and in the evenings, which was not unusual, but the quality of his presence in the house had changed. It had a density to it, a concentration, the way a storm has density before it breaks, and the house felt heavier around him. Cecily was writing. She was writing more letters than Dora had ever seen her write, working at the parlor desk with a speed and continuity that was remarkable. She sealed them herself and walked them to the front door herself, and gave them to the houseboy to take into town, which was unusual. She usually left outgoing correspondence on the front table. She was not going through the usual post. Robert was absent most of the day. He left early and returned late, on foot rather than on horseback, and came in through the rear entrance rather than the front. which told her something about where he had been, and more importantly, with whom. On the 18th of September, 3 men arrived who were not invited for supper but ended up sitting in the dining room for 3 hours. Dora cooked for them. She sent the food in through the back staircase as usual. She waited in the kitchen while they ate and talked. She came back to Claire as usual. When she came to Claire, the men were still at the table. She moved through the room the way she always moved through rooms, efficiently, quietly, without the particular weight of presence that requires acknowledgement. She cleared plates. She set down the dessert course. She refilled glasses. The conversation continued around her with an occasional lapse, not quite a pause, but an adjustment, a slight narrowing in the breadth of what was said while she was in the room. This was the standard adjustment that people made in her presence, a compromise between the desire to speak freely and the awareness that she was present, resolved in the usual direction, assuming that her presence was equivalent to absence. She was not absent. What she heard in those lapses and adjustments was the outline of a situation that, by September of 1857, had become something she had not quite anticipated, even with everything she knew. The document from the stranger on the 14th had not been what she had thought it was. It was not from the man in Baton Rouge, it was from a different direction entirely. It pertained to a different part of Gerald Haverfield's arrangement, the part that involved August Fry. She heard the name. She heard it said with the same calculated precision she had first heard it in 1855, and now it had context, and the context made the weight of those 2 years of keeping the name feel suddenly, vertiginously significant. August Fry was an agent. He worked variously and with great flexibility of allegiance for several different interests, and the interest he had most recently been working for was one that had been investigating the arrangement between Gerald Haverfield and the men from New Orleans for the better part of 2 years. She cleared the table. She went back to the kitchen. She stood at the fire and thought about a name she had kept for 2 years and what it meant that it had finally showed her what it was. On the 22nd of September, Robert did not come home. He had left that morning as usual, on foot through the rear, and by supper he had not returned, and by the time the household closed up for the night and the lamps were extinguished, he was still not back. Gerald did not send anyone to look for him. This was the detail that told her the most. In a household where the heir's movements had always been tracked with the anxious attention of parents who understood that their son's behavior had consequences for the family's standing, the absence of a search was not an oversight. Gerald knew where Robert was, or he knew in broad terms what had happened to Robert's presence, and he had decided, deliberately with whatever feeling was behind that decision, to let the absence stand. She did not sleep well that night. In the days that followed, the plantation operated on its surface as it always had. The cane was at the stage in the growing season that required a particular kind of attention. The kitchen produced 3 meals a day. The household routine continued its rhythm. But underneath the surface, Dora felt the structure of things shifting. Cecily had received a letter that made her, for an afternoon, stop pretending. She sat in the parlor with the letter in her lap, and her hands in her lap, and her face doing something she did not manage to smooth back into its usual composed arrangement before Dora had crossed the hall with a tray and seen it. Dora set down the tray and left without being dismissed, which was irregular, and Cecily did not call her back. October came. Philip did not return from New Orleans. Robert had sent word, not to the main house but to the quarters, through channels that had their own architecture and their own efficiency, that he was safe, and that people should know certain things and should make certain decisions accordingly. Dora heard this not from Robert directly, but from others who heard from others in the way that information moved in the parts of the plantation that the main house did not think of as having channels. Gerald Haverfield received several more documents over the course of October. She knew this from the steady traffic of men with satchels coming through the front door and from the weight of Gerald's silence at the occasional meals he still took in the dining room. He had stopped riding out in the mornings. He had stopped going into town. He was staying on the property with the quality of a man who is not staying by choice. Cyrus Holt did not return. The first week of November, 2 men arrived with a document that was different from all the others. They were not from New Orleans. They were not the kind of men who conducted the sort of business that had been conducted in that study for years. They were official men, in the particular way that officials looked in 1857 Louisiana. The quality of their dress, the way they sat their horses, the formality of their address when they presented themselves at the front door and asked to speak with Mr. Gerald Haverfield. Dora was in the kitchen when they arrived. She knew they had arrived from the sound, the particular sound of official men who have come with documents, which is different from the sound of ordinary visitors. She did not walk the jasmine path that morning. She did not need to. She knew, with the deep certainty of someone who has been watching a pattern complete itself for months, that what she had heard through the open window of that study, in June and in July, and at the bottom of the back staircase in the conversation through the unlatched door, was now being heard by men who had the authority to do something about it. She stood at her fire and felt something that she examined carefully because she was not sure what it was. It was not satisfaction exactly. It was not vindication. It was something quieter than both of those things and more complicated. It was the feeling of a record being made. Gerald Haverfield left Belhaven in November of 1857 under circumstances that the official record of the period describes in the dry, particular language of legal process. The details are not entirely clear from those records because official records of the period were subject to the same incompleteness that Dora had noted in the records of her own life. Information was kept when it served the interests of the people who kept it, and omitted when it did not. What the records do show is that by early 1858, Belhaven was in the process of significant change. Legal proceedings had been initiated that would, over the following years, resolve into outcomes that were imperfect, as such things always were in that period and place, but that were not nothing. Robert Haverfield's name appears, in a different context and in different records in the years that follow. He is associated with people and activities that his family's world would have found unforgivable, and he appears to have gone forward with this association without apparent concern for their opinion of it. Philip returned eventually to Louisiana, but not to Belhaven. Cecily went back to Virginia. The letters she had been writing to her sister in Richmond, letters that had been arranged through the friend in Baton Rouge and sent through a channel that bypassed the official post, revealed themselves, in the years that followed, to have been part of a careful preparation for precisely this outcome. Cecily Haverfield had, with the efficiency she brought to all things, made arrangements. She was a practical woman. Dora remained at Belhaven through the transition period. This is one of the things that the pages make clear, or rather, that the secondary account she sent through the later channel makes clear. The letter that arrived in an archive and was eventually connected, through careful scholarship in the 1970s and 80s, to the pages themselves. She stayed because the kitchen needed running, and the people in the quarters needed the kitchen running, and the chaos of a collapsing plantation structure has particular effects on the people who have the least structural protection within it, and she was not willing to add to those effects by leaving. She cooked, she kept the kitchen, she made sure there was food, and she waited. The pages themselves were found in 1923. The kitchen house at what had been the Belhaven Plantation had been standing since the 1840s, and it had survived the Civil War and Reconstruction and the long decades after in the condition of most outbuildings that are no longer used for their original purpose, intermittently maintained, gradually weathering, occasionally repurposed for storage. The main house had burned in 1871. The cause was officially listed as accidental, though there were people in the area who had their own account of events which was never formally recorded. The kitchen house did not burn. In 1923, a woman named Agnes Turode, a schoolteacher in East Baton Rouge Parish, the granddaughter of a woman who had lived in the quarters at Belhaven and who had been one of the people Dora was cooking for during the transition period, was helping to clear the old building, which was being demolished to make way for a different structure on land that had changed hands multiple times since the 1860s. Agnes found the chest. She found it because it was too heavy to move easily, and when she investigated why it was too heavy, she found the insert. And when she removed the insert, she found the space below, and in the space below she found the oiled cloth, and inside the oiled cloth she found the pages. She could read. Her grandmother had made sure of that. She sat down on the floor of the old kitchen house with the pages in her lap, and she read them. It took her most of the afternoon. When she was done, she sat for a while without moving in the dusty light of the old building with the pages in her hands. Then she made a decision that would take her years to fully execute, that would require her to navigate institutions that were not designed to receive what she had found, that would cost her more time and effort and occasional grief than she had anticipated when she sat on that floor. She decided to make sure the pages survived. Here is what we know and what we don't know, and the distance between these two things is where this story continues to live. We know that Dora existed. Agnes Turo's account of finding the pages, written in a journal she kept from the 1920s through the 1950s, is specific and detailed and has been examined by people who know how to examine such things. The pages themselves, or rather, photographs and transcriptions of them, because the originals are fragile and kept under conditions that protect their physical survival, have been seen by scholars of Southern history, archivists, and historians specializing in the period. The question of their authenticity has been examined. The paper, the ink, the writing, all are consistent with the materials and methods available in 1850s Louisiana. The handwriting shows the characteristics of a self-taught writer, which is consistent with Lenny's profile. The content contains specific details, names, financial figures, arrangements, the name August Fry, that have been cross-referenced with other records of the period, official records that the pages had no access to and yet describe with a consistency that is difficult to explain except by concluding that the person dictating them had direct knowledge. August Fray, specifically, is a name that appears in a separate archival collection. A collection of records from an investigation conducted in 1857 and 1858 by a federal agent operating in Louisiana, records that were themselves stored in an obscure archive and not widely known to scholars until the 1980s. The investigation involved several planters in the Baton Rouge area and a network of financial transactions that the pages describe. The name August Fry appears in both the pages and the federal investigation records. There is no way to explain this, except that Dora heard it and Lenny wrote it down. What we don't know is more extensive. We don't know with certainty what happened to Dora after the transition period. There are records that may pertain to her, a woman of her approximate description, approximate age, first name Dora, appears in documents from the early 1860s related to a community in a different part of Louisiana. These records cannot be definitively connected to the woman in the pages. The connection is plausible but unproven. We don't know what happened to Lenny. The boy who wrote the pages appears in no record that can be specifically identified as him after the fall of 1857. This could mean many things. The most hopeful interpretation is that he, like Robert, moved into a different world and left fewer records because the world he moved into was one that kept different records. The less hopeful interpretations are the ones that the period makes available and that we do not need to specify to understand. We don't know the full content of the pages because some of them were damaged before Agnes Turo found them. Louisiana humidity had done work on the oiled cloth, and the outermost pages were partially illegible in places. The transcriptions that scholars have made are of the legible portions, with notations of lacunae. We don't know who the man in Baton Rouge was, who was asking questions that Cyrus Holt believed should be addressed with means beyond mere discouragement. The federal investigation record suggests several possibilities, but none of them can be confirmed as the specific person Dora overheard being discussed. We don't know, and can never know, How many conversations Dora heard that she did not put in the pages because they did not seem relevant, or because the 9 nights were finite, or because some things she carried in herself and chose not to externalize. The pages are what she chose to put outside herself. They are the record she decided to make. Everything beyond them is the larger archive that no system of records ever built was equipped to hold. The archive of what was known by people who were not supposed to know it, preserved in nothing but memory, for no span of time except a lifetime. We're near the end now. But before we get there, there's something you need to know about what happened after Agnes found those pages. Because what she found wasn't just a document. It was a map of consequences. Stay with us. Agnes Turow spent the years from 1923 to 1938 doing something that required more patience and strategic intelligence than most of the activities that history tends to reward with recognition. She was trying to get someone with institutional standing to care about a bundle of handwritten pages found in the false bottom of a kitchen chest on a former Louisiana plantation. She approached libraries, she approached universities, she approached newspapers. She approached the offices of people she believed would understand the historical significance of what she had found. The responses she received ranged from polite disinterest to something less polite. This is not surprising. 1923 was not a moment in American history when the institutions she was approaching were particularly well configured to receive what she was offering. The South of the 1920s was a particular place, and Louisiana was a particular state within it, and the story that Dora's pages told was a story about a family whose descendants might still have interests and the ability to express them. She did not stop. She kept the pages safe, and she kept approaching people, and she kept a journal of her efforts that is as valuable in its own way as the pages themselves, because it documents the second layer of the story of what happens to truth after it is written down and before it is received. In 1938, she found someone, a young historian named Emmett Kavanaugh at a small college in New Orleans who was working on a study of Louisiana plantation economics in the antebellum period and who had encountered, in the course of that research, the federal investigation records that mentioned August Frey. He had been confused by that name, by its oblique significance in the records, and had been trying to understand it for several months. Agnes showed him the pages. He understood immediately. He also understood immediately that getting this material into a form that could survive institutional processes would require time and care and a level of discretion that the material itself seemed in some way to call for. He and Agnes corresponded for several years. He cited the pages obliquely in a monograph published in 1941. He did not name his source, and Agnes was not named in the acknowledgments. At her request, because she was a schoolteacher in a parish where being known as the person who had surfaced this material could have made her professional life considerably more difficult. This too is part of the story. The pages eventually reached an archive. In 1949, Agnes Turow deposited them, the originals, carefully preserved in the oiled cloth she had also kept, with a specific archive at a specific institution that she had spent years identifying as the most likely to hold them properly. An institution that had a particular commitment to collecting the records of people whose records were not usually collected, that had been founded with exactly this gap in the historical archive in mind. She accompanied the deposit with a written account of how she had found the pages, the story of her grandmother's connection to Belhaven, and the history of her efforts to find them a home. She also included the journal. All of this is now archived. All of it can be found by people who know where to look and have reason to look. The scholarly examination that produced the most complete account of what the pages contain and of what they mean in the context of the other records they connect to was published in 1987 by a historian whose name is in the public record and who spent several years working with the material in the archive. The account is careful and scholarly and methodologically precise. It does the things that good historical scholarship does. It establishes provenance, it cross-references, it acknowledges uncertainty, it argues for a reading rather than imposing one. It also contains at its conclusion a passage that is worth quoting, because it articulates something about these pages that all the methodology cannot fully account for. The remarkable thing about Dora's account is not that it exists. It is that it survived. The institutional conditions of the antebellum South were comprehensively designed to prevent exactly this kind of record from being made, and the conditions of the subsequent 100 years were not much more hospitable to its preservation. That this bundle of pages traveled from the false bottom of an oak chest in a Louisiana kitchen house to an archive where it can now be read by anyone with a library card is not a small thing. It is, in fact, a very large thing. A fact about human persistence that is more interesting, finally, than most of the facts about human cruelty that the pages themselves contain. The ending that is also a beginning. There are things that Dora could not have known when she sat in her kitchen in August of 1857 and began to dictate. She could not have known that the pages would survive. She put them in the best hiding place she had available, and she covered them with beans and rice, and she went to bed. And whatever she believed or hoped about their future, she was not in a position to guarantee it. She had done what she could do, and the rest was not in her hands. She could not have known that a woman she had cooked for, a woman in the quarters whose name was Celestine, and who had sat in that kitchen more evenings than either of them could count and eaten what Dora made and talked and listened, would have a daughter who would one day come to clear an old building and find a chest too heavy to move and change the course of a docu, meant that had been waiting 66 years for someone to come. She could not have known that the name August Fry, which she had kept for 2 years without knowing its value, would be the key that unlocked the academic credibility of everything else she had said. She could not have known, and could not have been expected to know, that what she was making in those 9 nights in the kitchen, crouching over pages with a 14-year-old boy who wrote in a self-taught hand by the light of the kitchen fire, was a document that would be read in the 20th century by people who understood it to be, among other things, a map of how a certain kind of power arranges itself and a record of the particular intelligence required to navigate it from below. She knew only what she knew. She knew it was true. She knew it mattered. She knew she was tired of carrying it alone. She wrote it down. Or rather, she spoke it, and a boy named Lenny wrote it down, in a hand that got more confident across the 9 nights of the project, the letters becoming steadier as the work went on, as if the act of writing something important was itself a kind of practice that improved the writer. By the last page, Lenny's handwriting was different from what it had been on the first. Scholars who have examined the originals have noted this. The hand that wrote, "My name is Dora," at the bottom of the final page, with the date August 22nd, 1857 beneath it, was measurably more assured than the hand on the first pages. What happened to Lenny, whether he used that hand again, in what context, in what life, is one of the things we don't know. But he had it. Whatever came after, he had that much. The jasmine path behind the Belhaven kitchen house no longer exists. The kitchen house no longer exists. The land has been through multiple owners and multiple configurations, and the specific geography of that 40-foot covered walkway where Dora walked every day for 18 years and listened through open windows has long since been absorbed into a different landscape. But in an archive, in a building that was built specifically to hold these kinds of things, in a folder inside a box, inside a drawer, there are pages. They are not in great condition, but they are legible. The scholars who have transcribed them have done so carefully, noting every lacuna, every damaged word, every place where the humidity of a Louisiana kitchen over 66 years won against the oiled cloth. The words that survived are the words that Dora chose to say, and Lenny chose to write, and an oak chest chose, by virtue of the peculiarity of its construction, to keep. And in the margin of one of the middle pages, not in Lenny's hand, but in a different hand, smaller and more careful, there is a single notation that scholars have puzzled over since the pages were first examined. It is not part of the dictated text. It appears to have been added later, not long after, but later, in ink of a slightly different consistency. It says, "She knew everything. She was always listening. No one knows who wrote it. No one knows when. It is there."